So thanks so much, everyone, for coming today. I really also appreciate everyone who's part of the effective computing class who turned in the assignments and answered the questions that I handed out to folks before the class. I really enjoyed reading all those responses. I've made my way through about 2/3 in terms of putting some comments on them. So I'll send comments back to you by the end of this week if you've turned those in. So I want to introduce, as Dr. Picard said, two somewhat separate but I think very related topics throughout my lecture today. The first is an introduction into positive psychology. And then the second will be talking about using some different technologies to combat depression. So I'm a professor at Northwestern University and a member of the Center for Behavioral Intervention Technologies. And so we're a lab that builds technologies, internet sites, mobile interventions designed to promote mental health and to combat mental disorder and also in other aspects of healthcare. And in today's lecture, I really have 3 goals. And goals, unlike birthday wishes, if I share them with you, they might still actually come true. And I set them up in terms of having an awesome goal, a great goal, and a good goal, because that way, even if I only achieve my good goal, I've achieved a good goal. So my good goal is hopefully I'll say something today that will be interesting enough to you that you'll share it with someone else throughout the day today. My great goal would be that I would say something that would inform the work that you do, especially for those members of the class. I know that you work on projects in this class and things like that, so maybe it would change the way you think about the projects you're doing. And my awesome goal would be that if I say something today, that might change your life. And I know that it's an ambitious goal, that's why it's an awesome goal, but I do think that some of the things I'm talking about today have that sort of potential. So I'm going to start off with talking about investigating well-being and character in psychology. So what is positive psychology? I think the answer I get most often when I identify myself as a positive psychologist is, duh, it's the opposite of negative psychology. If you're saying something's positive, that's implying that there's an opposite, there's something else on this continuum. This continuum exists between negative and positive states, and that positive psychology is on the upward end of the continuum. And I think actually that's a very unfortunate thing, a very unfortunate reaction to have, and it's a very unfortunate aspect of this field being called positive psychology. I've tried to come up with other names. I really can't come up with another one that works as well as positive psychology, so I think that's why the name endures. But a fundamental principle of positive psychology, and this gets at one of the questions that I posed to students in this class prior to today, was what is the difference between happiness and unhappiness, or more specifically in the question I asked, what's the difference between optimal mental health and mental suffering? And one of the key ideas in positive psychology is that happiness and unhappiness are not necessarily 2 different states existing on the same continuum. In fact, these things can coexist at the same time. And I think if we think about micro interactions of emotions, we can all notice these instances in our own life, kind of the term bittersweet. Or times when we have a lot of joy, but also a lot of sadness. People have experienced this a lot when they're moving on to new things. Moving to a new place, they're leaving behind their family, they're leaving behind the old things that they used to do, and they're approaching new challenges, which can be exciting and can be scary. We also see that these things do not necessarily form the opposite side of a continuum when we look at long-term effects of things. So kind of reaching into my work on mental health as well, we see that individuals can be experiencing mental suffering or mental disorders at the same time that they experience extremely positive or extremely beneficial, optimal times of functioning in their life. So there's lots of focus around, especially kind of serious mental disorders, things such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, moving away from a model that really sees the goal as being able to eliminate these disorders completely in an individual, but move towards recovery. And I think that in those regards, that's where concepts such as positive psychology, such as focusing on what it is that forms a beneficial life, a happy, flourishing life, comes into play. And we do see that if we look at different indicators of mental flourishing, happiness, positive psychological well-being, that these things do not predict things above and beyond the absence of a mental disorder. So for example, if we look at job productivity, work productivity, et cetera, we see that if we look at a person's level of happiness, we can actually predict how much work they might miss, absenteeism, productivity, things like that, above and beyond just the absence of mental suffering. And I think that's a point that a lot of the folks who responded to the question made, is that there's been periods in their own life where it's not that they're not flourishing, but they're not unhappy, and that they've moved to things above and beyond what they've been doing, and actually been able to find more increased happiness. And I would like to, I'll make a short detour here. For those of you who did not respond to the questions, and for those of you who did as well, and anyone else in this room right now, I do want this to be a little bit more of a a dialogue or a discussion if something I say is interesting to you. So feel free, if you have a comment or a question, to jump in. You don't have to wait till the end to ask questions. It's a lot more fun to me. I'm a little selfish. I like when I give talks to get feedback and hear what you guys say, because then I like to steal your ideas and change what I'm thinking as well. So what is well-being then? What is this concept we're going towards? And there are two dominant perspectives in psychology. One is what's known as the hedonic perspective. So this is focusing on happiness as a subjective state that looks at having positive cognitions, positive appraisals of one's life. That is, that if we ask you, are you happy? You'd say yes. And also experiencing frequent positive affect and infrequent negative affect, so that you experience a lot of positive emotions in your life and you don't experience very often negative emotions in your life. I often also refer to this hedonic perspective as the happiness is the warm puppy perspective, because it's that kind of feeling you get when you hold a puppy and you get that warm, joyful feeling inside. I mean, this hedonic perspective is really looking at happiness in terms of the joy that you get throughout your life. And it's really, really hard not to be happy when you see a cute little puppy. In fact, any kind of cute, this is my cute baby animal section here to try to infuse some happiness in here. It's really hard to feel sad when you look at any baby animal. This is a baby llama. Actually, I think this is technically a baby alpaca. But anytime you're feeling kind of down and sad, or feel like something's not working out, just Google baby animal and look at Google Images, and I guarantee you that's like a fail-safe way to feel better. So this is like the hedonic perspective. That's going to increase happiness from that way. Question? Comment?
But isn't it sad to feel that it's mainly hormonal and chemical process in our brain? Especially because you talk about baby, this notion of baby and happiness, that it's completely a chemical.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a completely chemical reaction, because I do think that there's some, like I said, in the hedonic perspective, there's aspects of cognitive evaluations, so that it's how we think about our lives as opposed to maybe what's actually going on in our life. So as an example of this, Danny Kahneman's done a lot of work looking at kind of the way people retrospect on their own happiness and their own well-being. And so he did a study where he did ecological momentary assessment, which is where you evaluate people throughout the day and ask them a lot of questions with regards to different things, looking at well-being and happiness. So if he pings people throughout the day and has them fill out questions, it actually turns out that the least happy time of a person's life is when they're commuting. Anyone who commutes for work or commutes for any other purposes probably can relate to this. Commuting is not fun. My dad, growing up, we lived in a suburb of Los Angeles, and he would wake up 3 o'clock in the morning to drive 2 hours so he could not hit the traffic. Commuting is a terrible, awful thing for people. Right under commuting, though, was spending time with one's kids. So, the two worst things you can do in life is commute and spend time with one's kids. But for some reason, we tend to keep having kids. And if you ask parents, they tend to say that their kids are something that bring them a lot of happiness. So what is this kind of difference? And what Kahneman found is that there's a difference between experienced happiness in the moment, which is what I think is feeding mostly into these biological things sometimes, is happiness is a biological reaction, and then happiness after in the retrospection. So if we ask people at any given moment, how do you feel with your kids? It's in that moment that the kid is, whining, or we need to clean up after them, or something else. It's like, oh, this kid's awful. But at the end of the day, when you think about what gives you meaning, what gives you purpose, what really makes your life a happy life, your kids contribute a lot to that. So I think that that's why when we define happiness from a hedonic perspective, it's this combination of the cognitive evaluation of one's life and the affective measures. So I think that's a great question. And this is a concept that Ed Diener has popularized as something that's so scientific sounding, just to give himself, I shouldn't say just to give himself tenure. Ed Diener is a fantastic guy, but to make it seem like something worth studying, he calls this concept subjective well-being.
I'm sorry, are you suggesting that retrospection is not a biochemical process?
I'm not suggesting that it's not a biochemical process, but what I'm saying here is that I think what I got out of her question was kind of the biochemical process that relates to the experience of pleasure. And so I think that there's a difference between the momentary kind of experience of pleasure in terms of pure positive emotion and then the separate cognitive evaluation, which has a lot of retrospection built in. And the other perspective I want to talk about is what's known as eudaimonic perspectives. So there's a lot of folks who have problems with this hedonic perspective, and they cite evidence that, well, just because someone says they're happy doesn't mean they're happy. And in fact, if we look at evidence around the world, we find that people actually report pretty high happiness in conditions that one might consider not kind of the optimal living conditions. So actually, if we look at the happiness of people in Western cultures, if we look at the happiness of people in the Maasai culture, if we look at the happiness of people in the slums of Calcutta, their self-reports on these cognitive evaluations of happiness are actually pretty equivalent. It's also the argument that's, it's also used to go against the argument that someone can be doing something that is detrimental to society, and if they still say it brings them pleasure, then that's okay. So eudaimonic perspectives focus on kind of more objective, I'll say it in that way, measures of happiness. And one of the problems here is what then is an objective measure of happiness? Many people who follow eudaimonic perspective draw their focus out of philosophy, ancient teachings of Aristotle, Socrates, and see happiness then is equivalent to virtue. So it's good character and it's aspects such as this. And I'll return to this a little later in my lecture today, but it's a perspective that says that it's not what you say that makes you the judge of your own happiness, but it's meeting these criteria which are established in terms of other ways. I actually draw my thoughts more as from a hedonic perspective. I think of myself more as a subjectivist, and so I want to talk a little bit about then if it is about subjective states, what is it that actually contributes to one's happiness? So what is it that makes us happy? This is just a little presentation of pictorial depiction of what it is that kind of contributes to one's average level of happiness. This draws from Sonia Lyubomirsky's work, looking at what are the determinants of happiness. And according to Lyubomirsky, there are three things that contribute to one's happiness. There's our genetic predispositions. So that's everyone has this genetically determined set point or kind of set range that says how happy you are. This is mostly due to luck, to genetics. If you have traits that kind of a temperament that predisposes you to happiness, you're more likely to be happy. We can all think about these people in our lives, the people who just seem like they're a fountain of energy, seem like they're a fountain of happiness, seems that like nothing that happens can get them down. And I think this kind of gets again to your question about kind of the biological predispositions underlying happiness. This does seem to be a strong determinant of one's level of happiness. I want to move now to the smallest section of the pie, and that's circumstances. And these are things that people actually often point to in terms of trying to change in order to make them happy. So these are things such as what kind of job you have, where you live, what's your economic situation, and we find that at least if we look at on a country level, if we look in the United States, there seems to be a very small relationship between income and happiness, for example. So in the US, it's about I think the last time the data was crunched, it was about $40,000, that after $40,000, any extra kind of increase in income doesn't increase the amount of happiness you have. There's some debate around this in the literature. I think if you follow this field closely, every once in a while you'll see a paper come out that says there is a relation between money and happiness, there isn't a relation between money and happiness, there is, there isn't, there is, there isn't, what's going on here? I think the way that I see that debate folding out is that if you have an economist compute the relationship between money and happiness, they'll actually tell you that there is a relation, because what they do is they take the log dollars and then they show that there's a nice linear trend between money and happiness, and they say, look, money and happiness are related. When you ask a psychologist, I'm a psychologist, so I can say things about psychology. We don't think about things like that, so we just take the norm. We take dollars, we correlate those with happiness. We see that this relation is curvilinear. We say there's not a relationship between these things. I think either way you fall in that debate, whether you say, well, if you take the log dollars, there is a relationship. If you don't take the log dollars, there's not a relationship. We can still think about this in terms of our own life, that if you pass $40,000 a year and you have to think about the fact that now you have to earn one more log dollar to increase your happiness, you realize that this becomes somewhat difficult to maintain. So if you go from $100,000 to $1 million, your happiness might increase, but the actual ability to go from $100,000 to $1 million in your life is not that easy to do. Where on the other hand, if we're thinking about things that are kind of within our realm of possibilities, we're considering the job, should I take the $100,000 job? Should I take the $110,000 job? Should I take the $120,000 job? Well, if I take the $120,000 job, that might lead to the most happiness for me. Those differences are not the things that actually tend to play out in our, in terms of affecting our happiness. Question in the back.
How do the studies adjust for the fact that being happier might cause you to earn more money?
That's a great question. There are actually some studies that look at this there are studies that control for a lot of different factors, follow people over longitudinal times. There's a very famous study with lottery winners that showed that people after they win the lottery are not actually any happier. And actually the kind of very interesting aspect of the study is they took lottery winners and they compared them to people who were in accidents and became either quadriplegics or paraplegics. And they found that after the event, after about the same amount of time, that those groups actually converged in their happiness. Now, the conclusion that people often say is that the lotto winners were not any happier than the quadriplegics or paraplegics. That's not actually true if you look at the data. The lotto winners were a little happier, but it was not statistically different. But I mean, there are kind of interesting ways to kind of look at this through more advanced methodology and different statistical techniques. And then when we converge all that data and it shows a very similar message, we tend to agree with that. So now I want to move on to the last remaining piece of the pie here, and that's what's marked as intentions, or what Lubomirsky also calls kind of intentional activities or volitional activities. These are the little things that we do, the behaviors and the cognitive activities, the ways of thinking about things that might actually tend to be able to boost our happiness. And I think in terms of thinking about what goes into that category of volitional activities, I want to draw on one of Seligman's theories, which he calls the PERMA theory, which is that well-being is a sum of the positive emotions, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. When I think about intentional activities and what are the intentional activities that actually do tend to relate to our happiness, I often say that these things are, not all that unintuitive. And actually, oftentimes the things that we find that contribute to happiness are things that if we asked our grandmother, what should I do to live a happy life, she would probably give us the good advice. I think, unfortunately, these are not the things that if we ask our peers, sometimes, our graduate mentors, other people in their life, that they would tell us that these are the things that we need to do to get a happy life. I think that there's a lot of different focus on kind of levels of achievement and other things that are, and I'm going to go on and contradict myself in the lecture a little bit in the second half here, levels of achievement, other things that we pursue that do not contribute to our own happiness, but are kind of goals that are put on us by other people. But I think that engaging in positive relationships with family members, with friends, being grateful, being kind, making the most of what you have. These are kind of the cognitive things that happy people, the behaviors that happy people tend to do. And a way that a lot of this literature has developed is that kind of starting in the 1970s, 1980s with a researcher named Michael Fordyce, is that what he did is he took a look at what it was that happy people did. So he brought a bunch of happy people in his lab, he interviewed them, he said, what is it that you're doing that makes you so happy? They told him. He compiled a list of those things. He taught a class in this. Imagine that I've actually taught a class in this. It was called Positive Improvement, or Self-Improvement, Positive Psychology, and Flourishing. And the goal of the class was to make everyone's life better. But you go through this course and you learn the skills and strategies to make you happy. And sure enough, the people who employed these strategies were able to lead a more happy lifestyle. And so what is the, how does then those positive behaviors, those positive activities relate to increased well-being? And so the idea is that through doing these things, they actually lead to more of those hedonic perspective things that I was talking about. So things such as more positive emotions in the moment, fewer negative emotions in the moment, and more kind of positive cognitive appraisals. So I want to, I think when I say that, these are often the things that people's grandmother would tell us to do, then people come back with me with the response like, well, if our grandmother already knew these things, why should we study them? Why are we doing science on this? Why are we investing all this research, time, and effort into figuring these things out? Grandma already knew this. This is not a worthwhile topic to study. And my counter to that is, well, it is because we need evidence sometimes to convince people that these are the things that they should be doing, or these are the things that might be helpful to them. In fact, people tend to be very, very bad at predicting what it is that's going to make them happy. And this is a concept that Dan Gilbert has popularized, something called affective forecasting. So this is our ability to prospect into the future what it is, the result of a certain action or certain behavior, a certain circumstance will be on our happiness. And people are actually really, really bad at being able to make these predictions. They think that things will make them very happy when they actually maybe in the end do not.
How much variation is there in with people not being able to predict what will make them happy?
There's variation among all these things, but people tend to engage in some of the very similar biases and distortions. I'll talk a little bit more about those biases here. But I think that kind of the result of this is that because we engage in these biases, because we engage in these errors, we actually tend to pursue things that in the end don't make us happy. So people actually are pretty good at predicting what it is that's going to make them feel good or feel bad. That part we got down. We know that we don't want to be, we don't want to get in a car accident. We don't like going to the doctor and having shots, injections. We don't like going to the dentist. We know those things are bad. We know that, having a fast car is fun. Having a big house could be fun. Going to the beach is fun. We know lots of these things. What we're very bad at predicting is how good or how bad those things are going to make us feel. We often think that things are going to make us feel really good or really bad. And we're also really, really bad at predicting how long those good feelings or those bad feelings are going to last. And so this is, I have the picture of kind of the house comparison here and the car comparison here, because I think that these are kind of the thoughts, the ideas that we have kind of, or I should say people have on a very often basis. If I had that bigger house, I'd be happier. If I had that faster car, if I had that sports car, that'd be so much fun. I'd be so happy all the time. And one of the reasons we engage in this error, one of the reasons this happens so much is we engage in we engage in a bias called focalism, which is we focus very intently on one aspect of that experience, and we forget about all the other things that go with it. So if we think about the house, for example, we think, oh, it would be great if I had this bigger house. And so you're like, well, why would it be great? Well, because I have so much more room. I could put out all my stuff. I could spread out. I could have my office, my dining room, my kitchen, my wine cellar. I could have all these things and put them all together. But we forget about all the hassles that go into it. We forget about the property tax. We forget about the fact that someone has to clean that. We forget about the fact that we can't actually spend time in our kitchen, our dining room, our cellar, our office all at the same time. In fact, we can only spend time at one place at a time, and so we don't get to enjoy all those things at the same time. So we forget about all those other little things. And human beings do this a lot. We point towards kind of one explanation or one thing, and we kind of run with that, and we forget that that life is complicated, it's multi-determined, it's multifaceted, it's nuanced. And those nuances get glazed over in our memory. We also forget that kind of as we move to the bigger house, so you move to your bigger house and you start having all these new things and you start hanging out with new people and they come to your house parties. I mean, because if you have a big house, you have to throw a house party. And now the people you invite also are these people who have big houses and throw house parties. And so as you move to the bigger house, your aspiration rises. And you need more to kind of be satisfied. So kind of going back to this hedonic perspective that cognitive evaluations play such a large role in what makes us happy and what determines our happiness. As our level rises, so do our aspirations. And if we continue to kind of keep moving up in the world and keep looking around at bigger houses and faster cars and other things that we don't have, it's going to actually contribute to make us less and less happy. Another aspect, another kind of bias is what we call the impact bias, and that's kind of related to this combination that we aren't able to predict intensity and duration very well. So I want to just show a couple examples of where the impact bias happens in life. So if we ask college students how happy they would be or unhappy they would be with a particular college dorm, they often say that there are particular dorms that would ruin their lives. Actually, at Northwestern, I'm on the medical school campus, so I don't interact with undergraduates much, but when I used to teach this class at the University of Pennsylvania, every time I showed this figure, I would ask students, okay, like, which dorm is the dorm that you don't want to live in? And everyone would say the same dorm room. It's like, oh, the quad. No one wants to live in the quad. And I was like, okay, how many people here live in the quad? And a couple people raised their hand, and I was like, and how many people does your college experience suck because you live in the quad? And no one would raise their hand. And again, I think that this is because people underestimate the other things that are contributing to their college life. Most undergraduates I know are not spending very much time in their dorm room at all. They're out there partying, they're out there socializing, they're at their extracurricular activities, they're at Penn, their Greek life was very high, they're at their fraternities, their sororities, their sports, etc. And so they think going in that this dorm room will have a very big impact on their day-to-day life, their day-to-day schedule, but really it doesn't. It's the other things that kind of make up what it is. And so you find that over time these things actually don't tend to impact one's life very much. People, and this I think was also done from college students as well, which is how they could get a sample of people who broke up so quickly after 2 months. But people underestimate, or I should say, they overestimate how unhappy they'll be after a breakup. Women overestimate how unhappy they would be after they do get an unwanted result on a pregnancy test. So they say, I really wish I'm not pregnant, or I really wish I am pregnant, and then we look at their level of happiness, and they go into the test result, and it's the opposite of what they want, and we find that after a couple months, their happiness has gone back to the level it was before, or maybe even higher. And I think that, one of the reasons that this happens is that happy people tend to engage in a lot of what's known as post-decisional rationalization. So happy people tend to kind of build up the choices that they have and what happened and think about all the positive things. So parents, or I should say, people who are about to become parents, going in, they're like, well, I'm not really ready for a kid. I don't want a kid. They go get the test result. They find out they are having a kid. Instead of being like, oh, there goes my life, they start thinking about all the positive things that's going to come from that. Well, this is an exciting time. I'm going to play with that kid. I'm going to get all the enjoyment out of being a father or mother for the first time. And these things tend to take over and then affect one's happiness more than the things that one had predicted beforehand that's going to contribute to it. And this is the one that I like the most, being a non-tenured junior faculty member, that college professors overestimate how unhappy they would be 5 years after being denied tenure. So even if you go down your kind of chosen route in your profession and you have these goals that you think are very, very important, and everyone tells me that getting tenure is very, very important, so every day I'm trying to figure out exactly what I need to be doing to get tenure. Lo and behold, if such a day happens and I don't get tenure 5 years later, it probably won't affect my happiness. I'll probably go do something else that will actually engage my passion in my life more. So, even the things that we think are going to be these life-altering things for us that are going to completely alter our path, completely alter what we do in life, often do not tend to contribute to our well-being as much as one might expect. And I think that this also kind of speaks to the fact that the paths that we predict in our lives, kind of going back to this way of thinking about our ability to prospect about the future, the way that we see our life playing out is often not the way that we see our life, not the way that life actually plays out. And I see so many people who tell me about the story that of where they got to where they are, and there's point A, point B, point C, point D, mid-course corrections, and they kind of stumble their way throughout their life to end up getting to the success that they have. So these very linear, very direct paths in our life are maybe not always the way that things happen. Yeah?
So I see that we are very bad at predicting our emotions in the future. I was wondering, do we usually overestimate more unhappy states than happier states?
We do both. I think the thing is that the happy ones are the ones that we notice more, because when we estimate, when we misestimate an unhappy state, we kind of pat ourselves on the back and, oh, I got through that hard time, good job. And when we misestimate the happy states, we kind of get down on ourselves sometimes about it, and we think, oh, I put all this energy into getting this thing, and now I'm here, and it's not really actually what I wanted. So I think that those are the ones that kind of we notice, and I think in terms of trying to help people improve their life, because as a positive psychologist, my goal is to help people optimize their lives and optimize their mental health. I think teaching people to get better at being able to figure out what it is that's actually going to bring them happiness in the long term is the correction that I want to make. So that's why I think I focus a little bit more on that, but we do make those problems on both sides. So I wanted to present just a little bit of kind of experimental evidence that looked at this aspect, again, to demonstrate another bias that goes on in this affective forecasting thing that affects the ways that we plan our life. So I really like Snickers bars. It's actually one of my favorite candy bars there is. If you offer me a Snickers bar, I'm almost always going to say, yes, I will take it and I will eat it because I love it. And college undergraduates are very similar with this. They're very happy to take Snickers bars, and if you offer them Snickers bars when they do lab experiments, they tend to think this is the greatest experiment you've ever done, they've ever participated in as a psychology experiment. And so one researcher, again, Dan Gilbert at Harvard, took note of this and decided he was going to do an experiment where he would have people come and do a task in the laboratory, and that wouldn't actually be the experiment. The task would be just kind of the decoy. But what he would do is he would ask people to kind of plan out a snack schedule for doing this experiment. So, every time you come in, you do this boring task for me, but don't worry, I'll give you something to eat while you do it, and so it'll be a little better. And so you're going to come back to this experiment over 4 weeks. And each week, you're going to get a different snack. And what I want you to do is I want you to, in this first session here, we're going to plan out kind of the snack schedule you're going to get. So you have two choices. You can either, every week for the next 4 weeks, get a Snickers bar each time you come in, or, and this looks much like my lunch on a daily basis, you can have the Snickers bar, the apple, the Doritos, and the handy snacks. I don't know if people still eat handy snacks. This is what I ate growing up. I love these things, the little fake cheese and the little fake bread. But these are your choices. Which one do you want? Do you want the Snickers bar, or do you want the Snickers, the apple, the Doritos, and the handy snacks? And most people tend to pick your right, my left, I'm very bad with right and left, column here, and pick the Snickers, the apple, the Dorito, and the handy snacks. So they pick their snack schedule, they're set, they get going on the first experiment, and they say, okay, what do you want to eat right now while you're doing this, this task for me? And they say, I want the Snickers bar. So they pick the best one first, they eat their Snickers bar, they do the experiment, they go out, they come back the next week. Week 2, okay, you're gonna do this boring task for us. Which snack do you want now? And now the people who, most people who picked this right-hand column here now have the choice between the apple, the Doritos, and the handy snack, and they say, oh, why did I do this last week? I really, really want the Snickers bar. But instead, now they have the choice between the apple, the Doritos, and the handy snack. And week goes by, and they have to pick, they have fewer and fewer options to choose from. And that if we look at the actual kind of enjoyment people got out of the snacks, the people who picked this one, Snickers bar every week, actually say they enjoy those snacks more each week. But people tend to make the selection of the other option. And why is that the case? Well, that's the case because we often make choices in the immediate moment, even if these things are kind of long-term choices based on what we want in the immediate moment. So if you ask me what I was trying to plan a meal for what I would eat right now. If I ate 4 Snickers bars, even though I love Snickers bars, by the time I got to the second Snickers bar, I'd probably be pretty bored of the Snickers bar. There's diminishing marginal returns on our enjoyment of things such as this. That you eat one Snickers, it's really good. You eat this second Snickers, it's not as good. Marty Seligman in his book Authentic Happiness talks about this in terms of Haagen-Dazs. He says that the first bite is pure bliss, the second bite is like cardboard. My Haagen-Dazs does not taste like cardboard after 2 bites, but I agree with him that when I get to the bottom of the pint, I'm not feeling as good about myself. So if we think about what we want in the moment, this is a much better choice. We would want the variety of the Snickers, the Doritos, the apple, and the handy snack. But if we're actually trying to predict out what we want in terms of the future, the Snickers bars options each time is actually the thing that's going to bring us the most well-being and the most happiness. And so another mistake that kind of ties into this effective forecasting aspect is that we tend to make choices based on what we would want here in the immediate moment without the awareness of what it is that's going to kind of leads to our long-term happiness. And we do this so often in life that it's mind-boggling to me. Even though I study this, even though I give this lecture, I still go to the store and buy the yogurt variety pack, which they charge you more for, by the way. I don't know if you guys notice this. When you go to the store and buy a variety pack, it often costs more to buy the variety pack than to buy the individual ones. And I go and I eat my blueberry yogurt first, and then my blueberry yogurt second, and by the time I only have peach looking at me, I'm like, why in the world do I have any peach yogurt in the refrigerator? I really like blueberry a lot more. And so we do this all the time. And so I think that, as I said, these are biases that kind of affect us. These are biases that we can learn from. We can try to adjust ourselves according to these biases, but we're still going to find ourselves falling into these a lot. How do we effectively increase happiness? This is a very complicated model, but I think that kind of the take-home message here is that we want to increase more the positive events in our lives, and by this I mean the positive behaviors, the positive cognitions that we engage in, and that we want to make sure that we are aware of how these aspiration levels, these other kind of factors play in, and that we do our best to combat those things. And it's hard. It's something that takes kind of awareness and effort and challenge. But I do think that following kind of this work, it can kind of help you align your own life, or help you think about how to, if you are designing products, designing things to increase other people's well-being, design them in ways such that they might actually contribute to their long-term well-being. So I want to finish up this positive psychology section, moving a little bit more to the eudaimonic perspective and to focus on character. And so I think there's a lot of discussion in terms of what makes a good character, what defines a virtuous human being, what's the difference between feeling good and doing good. And there are lots of different virtues I think I could talk about today. So this is actually based on one of the most popular positive psychology classifications of virtue, which has 24 different character strengths organized under 6 different virtues. And those virtues are wisdom and knowledge, courage, love and humanity, justice, temperance, spirituality, and transcendence. I don't have time to talk about all of those today. I was really lost last week in terms of which one it was, or what it was I should actually talk about in this lecture today around which virtue. And then, lo and behold, I got a stroke of good luck. This is funny that I say this because I actually didn't get lucky at all, but one of my colleagues that I worked with when I was at the University of Pennsylvania actually won MacArthur Genius Grant last week, Angela Duckworth, for her work on grit and self-control. And I thought, well, if the MacArthur Foundation thinks Angela is a genius, then that's probably the research that I should present next week. So I want to talk a little bit about grit and self-control as an example of virtue and how grit and self-control can help promote kind of a better life and a life that maybe is more in line with the things that we want. So I want to start with this quote from William James from his novel, The Energies of Men. And he says, "Compared with what we ought to be, we are only half awake. Our fires are damped, our drafts are checked. We're making use of only a small part of our possible mental and physical resources. Men, the world over, possess amounts of resource which only exceptional individuals push to their extremes of use." And so the idea James is promoting here is that there's an aspect of our life that we're not really tapping into, that there's some things in us that we could get to if only we pushed ourselves harder, if we only pushed ourselves further, if we went beyond the places that we thought we would be capable of. I very strongly resonate with this quote. In my free time and the things I enjoy to do, I like running marathons. Many people think this makes me masochistic. In an even more masochistic way, I convinced my wife to run her first marathon 2 weeks ago. So this was fun for me because not only did I have her yelling at me for 26 miles, but I was going much slower than I'm usually used to going. But she enjoyed it and she did fantastically. But the point I want to make of this is that, to me, one of the things that's really fascinating about the marathon is that it's actually a task in which you push your body past a point in which your body tells you you're capable of doing. And so you have to find a way to kind of dig inside yourself and find some energy that you didn't think it was capable of. And James is saying here that that's going on in many places in our lives, that we have this unchained potential, this untapped potential that we could find, that we could access if only we can find a place to find it. And so kind of drawing from this, this effort of achievement that Angela focuses on in terms of her discussion of grit is that achievement comes from kind of 2 aspects. There's the aspect that a lot of us think of and a lot of us attribute things to, which is that the achievement comes from talent and then skill. So people who achieve well are achieving because they're good at it. They're smart, they're athletic, they have all the things that make it so they're able to get to the place that they want to be. And then I think another one that we don't kind of attribute as much focus on is that of effort. That effort actually plays a really, really big role in terms of being able to reach the goals of the things that we want. And that if you work harder and you work more focused, it might actually lead to better achievement in things. So grit is actually a combination of consistency and perseverance. And I think that both of those aspects are really, really important. So consistency means not moving around to lots of different things. And I think that this is an area where a lot of people nowadays, at least in my experience, especially when I was at the University of Pennsylvania teaching undergraduates in an Ivy League institution, that consistency is not something that's valued quite as much anymore, at least in the folks that I would work with. These would be the types of kids who their parents would tell them, well, go try medical school, and if that doesn't work, go to law school, and if that doesn't work, go to business school. Just find your niche, find what it is that really works for you. And that's positive in some ways, but that's also very problematic in terms of actually settling down and honing in and developing enough kind of experience and expertise in an area to really become successful at that. So this kind of draws from, I don't know, for those of you who've read Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, the 10,000 hour rule, the idea that to become an expert at something, you just have to put 10,000 hours into it and just put 10,000 hours into it. I say it like that, but that's a lot of time, it's a lot of focus. That to really, really succeed at something, you have to stick with it. And stick in the same area. And then the other aspect of grit is perseverance. So being able to push through those boundaries, to push through those things that would impede your progress. So actually some early research shows that if we look at geniuses, that this is actually one of the aspects we see most often in people who are kind of geniuses and succeed. It's not that these people are altogether the smartest people you've ever met. In fact, actually, we find that kind of people who are high achievers in the world, people who maybe we would say are geniuses in terms of what they have accomplished, are usually really smart, but not the smartest people you've ever met. They've passed this certain threshold, but they're not too far beyond that. But they do experience a lot of follow-through. They do what they're going to say, and they go that step further, and they really put themselves into whatever they're doing. In fact, in Wilmingham's study, he found that looking at 9 different colleges, controlling for SAT scores and high school GPA, the best predictor of who would graduate and receive different academic accolades was their follow-through in terms of different tasks. These people were more likely to be elected leadership positions in the clubs they were in. They're more likely to be captains of sport teams. They're more likely to win prestigious awards. So follow-through tend to trump the raw potential they have going into these places. And there's lots and lots of evidence for the benefits of grit in different samples. Angela Duckworth's work has done this in a variety of different places. So I wanted to just focus on 3 different samples where, all drawn from Angela's work actually, where she's explored grit in different populations and tried to look at some of the benefits of these things. So the first is just adults. And not surprisingly, kind of grittier adults, so that is people who score higher on this grit scale, are more likely to achieve higher levels of education. It's not surprising. People who have consistent interests, people who persevere, are more likely to go on past their high school, past their bachelor's degrees, into graduate programs. Anyone who's been in a graduate program knows that it's a test in perseverance. It's a test in banging one's head against a wall over and over again, and then dealing with failure and pushing through those. And so it's not surprising that grittier adults have more education. Another kind of interesting finding, though, is that older adults are, the older you are, the grittier you are, the grittier you are as well. And so I think that this is a very difficult thing to tease apart, kind of going to the question earlier about how we test whether money actually leads to happiness or happiness leads to money, teasing these things apart. There's no way to tease this apart in this data here. And I still think that this is something that is an open question, is do people get grittier over time? Do people learn to be more perseverant? Or is it just that those good old generations were just cut from a different cloth, that older folks are grittier individuals and they tend to persevere? I don't know. I think that really is a very open question. We do know that if we look at just personality, that conscientiousness increases over time. So people tend to get more conscientious as they go through life, and that conscientiousness is highly tied to grit. Yeah, question?
How do they measure grittiness? So there's actually or are there features for grittiness?
There's a scale that they use, and they use in kind of these initial studies. It's a very, there's like a 20-item measure that I think was used in these studies, and then there's a 10-item measure that's used less often. But it's 20 questions that kind of ask these questions about consistency of interest and perseverance. I'm a type of person who perseveres when I deal with failure, and it has pretty good predictive validity. Now, there's some other measures that they're trying to develop now. One of actually the things that Angela's working on, I know currently, is trying to get more objective measures of grit. So there's something she's developed where they go through someone's resume, and they have different ways to kind of code like what markers of grit are. So they look for like lots of achievements in the same area. So you get some points if you're like captain of this, captain of that, captain of another thing, but you get more points if all those things are in a similar area. So it's trying to capture this aspect that there's a consistency of interest that's really important, as opposed to like throwing all your eggs in different baskets.
But it basically sounds as though like she's just defining an arbitrary questionnaire and saying, I'm defining this as grittiness. Or is that not the case?
Well, I have a little bit of hesitance with the word arbitrary. But yes, there is.
Or a researcher defined.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, grit to her means perseverance and consistency of interest.
As defined by that questionnaire.
As defined by that questionnaire. But
how do you make the questionnaire? Like as a researcher, like how would you say?
I think that's a great question, and that's scale construction is a class, it's a dissertation, it's a life's work. So I'd be happy to talk with you a little bit more with it after the class if you want, but I think if we go down that way, it's going to be a long tangent. And I'd like to go through a little bit of the evidence showing that this question actually has validity, which I think is kind of the more interesting question that we have here. So I want to show kind of two different samples briefly, where this questionnaire has been used. And so I think that the way I kind of want to address your question more, instead of talking about how we develop a scale, is actually say, well, if we take that scale and we give it to people, if we ask people these 20 questions, does it actually predict things in the real world that would be interesting to us? And so one of the areas where I think it's really, really interesting is looking at West Point cadets. So West Point cadets is a very interesting sample, I think, because I don't know if anyone here has ever gone to West Point or has friends who go to West Point. It's not easy to get into West Point, even, amongst the other colleges. And, I say this to a group of people, I'm sure you've gone to colleges that are also not easy to get into. But to go to West Point, you need to get a letter from your local congressman. You have to go through all these physical tests. It's like going to a very elite undergraduate institution and then also doing all this extra stuff, all these extra hoops to jump in. It's not easy to go there. And then when you get to West Point, your first summer, you go through this intense boot camp. So you're this highly selected group. You're smart, you're athletic, you've been vetted by congressmen, you've been vetted in a lot of different ways. You go to this summer, and about 1 in 20 people drop out in that first summer. You haven't even made it to class yet. And you decided, this isn't the thing for me. I jumped through all those hoops, I'm done. And West Point is not overly happy with this because they put a lot of resources into these people to get them there, and then they lose a lot of them in that first summer. And so they were very interested in learning what is it that predicts who doesn't succeed in that first summer boot camps. And so West Point actually has developed their own scale that they call the whole candidate score, which kind of sums across these different measures, sums across their SAT scores, sum across their high school rank, their leadership potential, their physical aptitude. And it tries to use that to predict. So actually, if we take that grit scale, if we take those 20 items, we give those to West Point, incoming West Point students, and we compare that to other predictors, we actually find that that grit predicted summer retention. So it was right about for 94% of these incoming cadets, better than did self-discipline, better than whole candidate score, and that grit predicts these things when all other things are in the equation as well. So we throw all those other things in there, and they all kind of correlate and predict together. So SAT scores are not much better than whole candidate score, not much better than high school rank, but grit actually gives us more predictive ability above and beyond that. And kind of interestingly, grit is inversely related with SAT scores. So people who have the highest SAT scores do not tend to be the grittiest individuals. And we see this in a lot of places, that the people who have the highest aptitude ratings do not tend to have the highest scores on grit. So actually there seems to be something that people who do not quite have as much talent, maybe kind of raw talent, actually tend to be a little grittier.
So were they reported that they had higher grit after this? No.
Nope, so the students did not know that they scored high on this grit scale. And we can see that if we look at this versus the other predictors, this blue bar here is grit. That as we move up in terms of, this is quartiles of performance, that the higher we go, the better predictor grit becomes. And that actually the worst predictor whole candidate score becomes. So definitely even among these highest level people, the people achieving at the highest level, grit becomes an even more important factor. And so I think this is kind of where I get to think, thinking about that as grit and intelligence are kind of negatively correlated, that intelligence will take you so far, and talent will take you so far. That there's lots of people who can get to a certain point based on talent. And then you find that when you get to that next level, you really got to step it up. I think about this often kind of with professional athletes, that the people, I'm a big basketball fan, the people who ride the bench for an NBA team are so much more immensely talented than anyone else that I've ever played basketball against, I've ever seen play basketball, but these guys are still not getting any minutes out there on the court. And I think that what happens is that sometimes you get to this point where talent will take you there, but it's really that grit and that focusing that will take you those extra couple miles. Another place where, you know, they've found or examined the relationship between grit and achievement is the National Spelling Bee. And I know Angela was kind of impressed upon this study. She watched that movie Spellbound that came out all those years before, and she said, wow, this is fascinating. If only I could get access to those folks and be able to look at the grit of them. So she contacted the National Spelling Bee, and they were more than happy to allow her to give the grit questionnaire and give the grit scale. And so they were able to get 175 of the 273 finalists who took part in the Spelling Bee. They mailed them that grit questionnaire before the National Spelling Bee. They gave them some different kind of intelligence measures. So they had they gave them the Wechsler's intelligence scale to figure out what their verbal IQ is, and they looked at how grit was able to predict performance in the spelling bee. And again, these quartiles break up kind of performance, and you see the people who did better in the spelling bee, that grit becomes a better predictor as you go, and that, you know, verbal IQ kind of evens out. So of the people who were actually succeeding in the spelling bee, grit was able to predict performance in the spelling bee above and beyond verbal IQ, and gives a little bit of benefit above self-discipline. There's a question in the back.
I guess I'm not like fully convinced that grit is a good thing. Like just play like devil's advocate, right? Like in the West Point example, perhaps like the people with the higher SAT scores, like just to be devil's advocate, like say the people with higher SAT scores were smarter, so like halfway through West Point they decided that like this is not the best use of their life, so then they quit.
Fair enough. Yeah, so I think that you know, the argument could be made that there are times when it's, you know, useful to abort. And there are definitely there are unsolvable problems, there are unpassable barriers. So I'll agree with that. But I think that the question is, then what's the alternative place you go? And so I think that's, this is why I think grit actually tends to be beneficial, is that grit, with that consistency of interest, it actually keeps people in places where they're, you know, you might give up on one task, but you stay in a kind of a closely related area and you're able to use that past experience and still succeed from it. So I think that, so say for example, if I wanted, you know, I get to my tenure decision, they decide they don't give me tenure, and I say, well, you know, the psychology thing's not working out, so I'm going to go become a professional baker. I am not a very good baker. I would probably not succeed as a professional baker. It would take me years and years and years to become a professional baker. But there could be maybe a related thing where I could take my expertise from psychology and actually go and succeed very well then. And so I agree with you that there are maybe times when it's time to throw in the towel, but I don't know if that necessarily means that you should leave what you're doing altogether. And I think that the question of when to do that is a very important question as well. I'm kind of approaching the end of the hour here to do a break, so I'll actually just move to a short quote about that right now. So this comes from a book, Developing Talent in Young People, and it comes from a kid telling a story about his father wanting him to, when he wanted to give up swimming. So he said, at age 11, I wanted to bag it, giving up swimming, because I was doing very badly. My dad, at that point, did something that was very important. He said, if you want to quit, that's fine, but I don't want you to quit simply because you're losing. So I'm going to continue to drive you to workouts and force you to swim, and once you turn 12 and are at the top of your age group, you'll start to do well, and if you want to quit then, that's fine. And so I think that this kind of draws on the idea that it's not worthwhile to quit just because you're not doing well at something. Especially if it's something that you enjoy and something that you put your life into and put your passion into. A lot of people who succeed in things fail at things originally. Again, kind of as I'm a basketball fan, Michael Jordan was not the ¡1 overall pick in the NBA. He was not the #2 overall pick in the NBA. He was the #3 overall pick in the NBA. Went on to become one of the greatest basketball players of all time. If he looked and said, I was the 3rd pick, I really think I'm the greatest person, I should have been the 1st pick, I'm just going to give this up and go do baseball, we wouldn't have the dynasty that the Bulls had. We wouldn't have all those highlight plays that he gave us. And so I think that part of success is figuring out how to deal with that failure that we experience. And this is a quote that I'm going to end this section with, and then use this as a bit of a transition to the next section. That when I used to tell undergraduates at the University of Pennsylvania this, they hated me because I told them, if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. And they said, no, we succeed at everything. We do everything well. We only do things we succeed at. And I said, well, if you're not at a place where you're actually able to fail, you're probably at a place that's too safe for you. That really the places that we have the opportunity to grow, the places we have the opportunity to reach our optimal experience are the places where we can experience some failure. And that failure is actually not necessarily a negative thing if we can use it to grow on and use it to build on. And so I think that that's kind of the quote I'd like to leave this positive psychology section on, and think about in your own life, what are the things that are important enough, that are critical enough to you that you would be willing to fail at, that might actually be able to see some improvement later on in your life. So that's where I want to stop this section. We'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll jump back in and talk a little bit about depression.
Aim for a 5-minute break.
5-minute break.